Everybody, welcome. Exciting day. We're starting a new sefer here in Tanakh. We completed the book of Shemuel last week. We're starting the book of Melachim, the book of Kings, this week. And just like the book of Shemuel, we talked about how it was divided into two books, Shemuel Aleph and Shemuel Bet, but that wasn't the original way that it was done. It was sort of an arbitrary way that the rabbis kind of broke it up to make it easier to study. The same could be said for the book of Melachim. Traditionally, the book of Melachim is really one entire book. And the book spans the period of Shlomo HaMelech's rule, where he's going to build the Beit HaMikdash, until the Beit HaMikdash's destruction. So if you want to know what the book of Kings is, it's basically a historical account on a religious level about the time period from Shlomo until the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. The building of the Beit HaMikdash to the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. Good question. Who is the author of the book of Melachim? Any takers? Well, if we're going to the destruction, what'd you say? Yirmiyahu. Very good. Chazal teach us that Yirmiyahu HaNavi, Jeremiah is the author. Now, it doesn't say anywhere in the book that he's the author, and the name of the book is not Yirmiyahu. There's a separate book in the Tanakh, which is all of Yirmiyahu's prophecies. But given the fact that the book details our progress to the destruction of the temple, and the Navi, who most captures the destruction, is Yirmiyahu, the rabbis basically say that Yirmiyahu went back and said, how did we get here? From a historical narrative perspective, how did we get from the building of the Beit HaMikdash to the point where the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed? One interesting thing to keep in mind is actually Yirmiyahu, based on this rabbinic tradition, has three separate books that he writes in the Tanakh, all of which center around the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. And each one comes from a different angle. So the book that we're studying, the book of Kings, really focuses on the leadership of the Jewish people. It focuses, as its namesake is, on the kings themselves and how they led the people and how they ushered in sometimes idolatry and spiritual corruption, and in other cases, renaissance and spiritual elevation. And we go through a nice roller coaster period throughout the book of Kings, as much of the Tanakh is. So that's one book that Yirmiyahu wrote. Then he has a separate book called the book of Yirmiyahu, which details all of his prophecies during the years leading up to the destruction, as he interacts with some of these kings at the end of the period before the Beit HaMikdash is actually destroyed. And it's a gut-wrenching book to read because Yirmiyahu over and over again is telling them, repent and change, and this is wrong. And very often he's speaking to kings who are experiencing a lot of prosperity and success on an economic and financial level, but he's telling them spiritually we're dead and bad times are coming ahead. Of course, it's very hard for people who are experiencing prosperity to notice that something is going wrong until it's too late, right? So that's Yirmiyahu, and he gets thrown in jail and he gets his life threatened, and it's terrible for Yirmiyahu. Then Yirmiyahu has a third book, which is the book that we read on Tisha B'Av, the book of Echa, the book of Lamentations, which is a gut-wrenching, first-hand account of the atrocities of the destruction of the temple and the fall of the city of Yerushalayim. A line-by-line, basically, eyewitness account of the horrors that the Babylonians put upon the Jewish people as the temple and the city of Yerushalayim were burnt to the ground. So that's Yirmiyahu's three books. He is the prophet of destruction. And in the book of Kings, he speaks about what went wrong from a leadership perspective that led us to the destruction of the temple. Kings is again divided into two books, Kings 1, Melachim Aleph, and Kings 2, Melachim Bet. But that's again a very arbitrary just divide, kind of to create an easier study, to break it up. But really, it's all one book. Questions? Yes.
First two Kings included in the book of Kings.
Why weren't Shaul and David included in the book of Kings? So I think that Shaul and David are their own book based on around Shemuel, the prophet who anointed them, to give us the foundation of monarchy, what monarchy rests upon. The book of Melachim is really a show of how that monarchy then went bad, and eventually the kingdom tore in two, and the paralleling of two different kingdoms leading us to destruction, and how the leadership caused that to be. So I think that that's the reason why there's a little bit of a separation. We will see that the first two chapters will involve David a little bit, but really more about David passing the mantle of of rulership to his son Shlomo and the foundation that he gives to Shlomo. Any other questions about just the introduction of the book of Melachim? Okay, so I think we're ready to get started and read. And as we uncover more and more going through the text, we'll bring more and more to life about the nature of this book. So as I said, the book begins talking about David at his old age, ready to bring to transition the kingdom to the next generation. What's unfortunate is we don't actually have any indication who should be the next king, at least not from the book of Shemuel, right? We saw that David really loved Shlomo when he was born to Bathsheba, but there's no promise yet of who David's successor is going to be. David kind of just leaves that hanging up in the air, and that's going to come to a head here in the first chapter, as we will have a tug of war between two of David's children, Adoniah and Shlomo, over who will ascend the throne in David's place. Adoniah, we will see by all measures, is the worthy party for being the next king, if not for the fact that David, as we will uncover here, promised it to Bathsheba, even though we didn't see that promise just yet. So there's much to uncover here. Verse 1, Pasuk Aleph. V'hamelech David zaken ba bayamim. The king David was elderly. He was in a coming of years, advanced in years. V'chasu babgadim. They covered him with clothing, with blankets. V'lo yihamlo, and nothing could warm him up. So in his old age, David suffered from a difficult time keeping his temperature. He was very cold. He's frail. And that's the image that we have of David, and nothing will warm him up. Vayomeru lo avadav. His servants say to him, Yevakshu ladoni hamelech na'ara betula. Why don't we go seek out for the master, the king, a virgin girl, ve'amda lifnei hamelech, let her stand before the king, uthi lo sochenet, and she should be for him a sochenet. The word sochenet is a very unique word. We don't find that in many places. Most people translate it as some kind of attendant or server. What do they have over there? An attendant. Essentially, what her job is, as the next words say, v'shacheva behekecha, she will lie with him, v'ham ladoni hamelech, and she will produce body warmth for David to warm him up, which the blankets are unable to do. This was the plan of the servants. In fact, they follow through. Verse 3, v'vakshu na'ara yafa bechol givud Israel. They look for a beautiful young girl, a maiden, in all of the boundaries of Israel. Vayimtseu et Avishag HaShunamit, and they find a woman by the name of Avishag, who is from the tribe of the Shunamit. Vayaviu ota lamelech, and they bring her to the king. Verse 4, V'hana'ara yafa ad me'od. The woman is exceedingly beautiful. V'tehi lamelech sochenet, and she served the king as an assistant. V'tesharetehu, and she served him, she waited upon him. V'hamelech lo yida'a, but the king did not know her. That is to say, the king was never intimate with Avishag HaShunamit. And that is an important point to mention, that although she was incredibly beautiful, David, at the end of his age and at the end of his life, his frailty, he's not probably even able to, but regardless, he restrains himself and he does not practice intimacy with Avishag HaShunamit. Before we move on, let's just pause there and ask how we feel so far about this chapter. Verse 4, right? To a class of women. Okay. Huh? Right. It's always the answer. I don't know if it's always the answer. Always is a lot. So let's ask the question this way. What do these 4 Pisukim remind you of? Is there another story in the Torah, or in the Tanakh, I should say, that reminds you of seeking to find the girl who's going to be there for the king? Anything? Good. So it definitely, the language here is very, very similar to the story of Megillat Esther, to Achashverosh and David. And I actually believe that in these first 4 Pisukim, the narrator is making a parallel between David and Achashverosh. We find a lot of similarities. The king needs a woman. They're going to do a search and they're going to try to find a virgin, beautiful girl who's going to come and serve the king, right? Sounds, and the language, Yevakshu lamelech, it's the servants, the avadim, who are presenting this plan, sounds very much reminiscent of Achashverosh's beauty pageant and his search for a replacement for Vashti. But there is what? What? Oh, that Achashverosh is for that? It happened before. But sometimes you look at the way, you're right, in the sense that Yirmiyahu wrote it that way. Perhaps there's a little bit of Ruach HaKodesh, or at least Achashverosh was written that way to reflect upon David. But the parallels between David and Achashverosh call one very important difference into play, which is namely, he was not intimate with her, right? So unlike Achashverosh, who is this king who's using his power to, have pleasure wherever he wants, David is exactly the opposite. David is doing this to survive. He is not engaging whatsoever in any kind of pleasurable activity. So it actually contrasts. It wasn't Achashverosh's idea either. But Achashverosh goes above and beyond. The rabbis actually point this out. They point out that when there was a search to find the woman for David, every person offered their girl, their daughter, to be there, right? They all offered their daughter should come and serve the king because they knew what? They knew the king would not defile her. It's not the job. That wasn't the job description. So they knew to serve the king and to help David at the end of his life, to be able to prolong the life of the king, that is a very noble cause, and she will not lose out in any way because they were confident that the king was not using her for that purpose. When it came to Achashverosh, what did the rabbis say? Every person hid their daughter. They all hid them. Why? Because they knew that Achashverosh would defile her, and that would be the end of her life, because once the king sleeps with you, you are not allowed to marry anybody else. You belong to the king's harem, to the Melachim. And so you could see the contrast to the extent that in Megillat Esther, it says that Achashverosh had to bribe the women. He had to give them whatever they wanted. They were allowed to make requests before they would come to be with him, because otherwise people were not giving up their daughters so quickly to be with the king, right? They knew that there was a long shot that they would ever be the queen, and they didn't seem like it was a position they really wanted. So you can see the contrast here between David and Achashverosh, and I think that's an important point just to illustrate that at the end of his life, the way the text looks at David, and it also shows you the purpose of the king. The king is not meant to abuse his power. David is not making an abuse of power over here. Let's continue reading, and we'll actually see another element of this Avishag story, because you kind of have to ask yourself the question, what is the purpose of this story? Like, why does the text even tell it to us? We could have easily glossed over it. It has nothing to do. The rest of the chapter is going to be about who's going to take over for David as king. Why do we care about any of this? Is an interesting thing to examine. Yeah. Oh, good point. Are the begadim significant parallel to Purim, like costumes?
Begadim, like, that was a big part of Purim.
Okay. I didn't think about that connection. Right. So begadim could be a parallel there. I didn't see it as much about that, but the rabbis do notice the idea that clothing will not warm him up, and they have a very difficult statement that Esther's not going to like the statement, but they have a very tough statement. You know what the rabbis say? They say, why is it that the clothing did not warm David up at the end of his life? Because he what? Because he tore the coat of Shaul, right? Because going back to the book of Shemuel, when he was in the cave and he had the opportunity to kill Shaul, I said Shemuel, I meant to say Shaul, excuse me. What? I said Shaul? Okay, fine. No, because there's also Shaul tearing the coat of Shemuel, which I don't want to go back to that. But for David, when he's in the cave and he has the opportunity to kill Shaul, and he refrains. But what does he do? He cuts off the corner of his cloak. And the Torah and the Tanakh tells us that he felt very guilty about that afterwards. He used it to show Shaul, look, I had the opportunity to kill you, but I didn't, so stop chasing me. But the rabbis say a person who disrespects clothing will not help them at the end of their life. And so the rabbis show how meticulous God was with every action that David did. Since he disrespected the clothing of Shaul by cutting off the corner at a time that he was the king, the clothing does not suffice for David. And this will be part of a larger discussion that we'll hopefully have by the end, which is two different ways to read our chapter. We're going to do the first reading of our chapter from a political perspective. Then we're going to read the chapter again, or at least go through it again, from a spiritual perspective, where this chapter actually brings us back to all the sins of David and shows us that the transfer of power to Shlomo is happening over the cloud, the shadow of David's sins. Yeah. Possibly. What would that mean? Like that he didn't feel the presence of God anymore. Possibly, but I have a harder time with that one because David definitely ends his life, despite all of the suffering, in the good graces of Hashem very differently than Shaul. It's something I'd have to think a little bit more about. But it's possible. Usually physical things that go on are reflective of spiritual things happening underneath the surface. Someone wanted to say. Sometimes the text will mask things in a physical way to kind of hint towards deeper things, but I'm not so sure about it. I'm not convinced necessarily. Let's continue forward at verse 5 here, as now we get into the section of the chapter where someone tries to assume the throne. Verse 5, Adoniah ben Chagit mitnaseh lemor ani imloch. Adoniah, the son of Chagit, one of David's wives, went about boasting, I will be king. He said, I'm going to ascend the throne. Vayas lo rechev uparashim. He gathers for himself, provides for himself chariots and horsemen. V'hamishim ish ratzim lefanav. And 50 people who are running in front of him. We've seen that image before, yes? People running in front of the chariot of the king is a sign of kingship, right? That you are the king. We saw this by Avshalom, David's son, who also tried to rebel against David. He also did the same type of procession. So Adoniah senses that with David's frailty and everybody focused on his health, there is a vacuum. There's an opportunity here without David having assigned any successor for him to kind of jump in, and he does so in dramatic fashion. And it seems like people start to gravitate to him. Verse 6 is a narrator's point, which is very interesting. Velo atzavo aviv miavav lemor. David, his father, had never scolded him, had never rebuked him, saying to him, Madua kacha asita, why have you acted in this way? Vegamhu tov to'ad, Adoniah was also very good looking, me'od, exceedingly good looking. Ve'oto yalda ahare Avshalom, and he was born after Avshalom. So what do we know about Adoniah, his son? We know he's very good looking. We know that he was not disciplined as a child by his father David. He was allowed to do what he wanted. And he was born after Avshalom. What do each of those three details tell us about the nature of Adoniah? He's entitled, he's spoiled, good, he's a brat. But he was born after Avshalom. So what does that mean for us? He didn't see what happened to Avshalom, right? He was not alive. He knows it happened, but it's very different witnessing something firsthand than hearing about it afterwards. So let's assume for a minute he heard that he had an older brother who tried to take over and he failed, right? But the fact that he didn't see it means maybe I could be different. Had he watched firsthand Avshalom try to do what he's about to do and fail, maybe it would have been a little different to him. And of course, what about his good looks? Good looks, what? A little like Yosef, right? Anytime the Tanakh tells us somebody is very good looking, it's not just because they want to describe them, it's because that good looking aspect has some kind of effect on him, and it's usually what? Usually negative. It usually means that the person becomes a little bit arrogant, full of themselves. Grace pointed out the idea of Yosef. Whenever the text tells us that Yosef was good looking, the rabbis point out he got a little too full of himself, and that's why something bad happens to him afterwards. He started stroking his hair in the mirror, he started worrying about his appearance. Eshet Potiphar starts to challenge him, right? So anytime the Torah tells us that somebody is good looking, it usually has a bearing on the story, and it's not always positive. One exception to that could be Rachel, right? Only when the men are good looking is there a problem, right? Men are good looking, is there a problem? All right, okay. Yeah. It could mean that he's just younger than Avshalom, right? Old enough at this point to maybe ascend, but definitely the fact that he's younger, at least, right? So maybe he wasn't in the story. So maybe that's the saying he wouldn't after he died, but he wasn't involved so much in what went on. Okay. The fact that the text again tells us that David was responsible for not disciplining him also lays a little bit of blame on David here. The text is criticizing David for once again not doing enough to raise his children, right? Which kind of gives us the impression that, and this is where that we'll have that reading that kind of looks at this whole story in the cloud and the shadow of David's sins, which is that after David committed that sin with Bathsheba, whatever the sin was, again, go back to our study of Shmuel, But clearly, it had a major impact on David. One of the impacts that it did on David was David became very reserved. He became very removed. He kind of accepted his fate because he knew that the punishments upon him were that bad things would happen in his family and strife was going to be amongst his house. So you could see that David kind of took a hands-off, passive approach towards his children. And that's why he has a problem with Amnon. That's why he has a problem with Avshalom. He has a problem with Adoniah. By the end of this chapter, David will have lost 4 children. 4. One of them died because of the aftermath of the sin, and 3 of them are killed. Avshalom is killed in battle. Amnon is killed by Avshalom. And Adoniah is eventually going to be killed in the next chapter by his son Shlomo, right? So that's painful. That's a lot. And it definitely calls some level of responsibility to David in this process, that David, and it tells you that David, to a degree, checked out, right? He checked out in the wake of the sin because he said, whatever's going to happen with my children, it's divinely ordained. It comes from God. And the text might be saying that might not have been the best approach to go ahead and take, but it is what David did. Yeah. Well, where are the... Okay, you said it, not me. That's why I left it out there. I did not go there. Good? Okay. We'll continue. Verse 7. Who should join Adoniah in this attempt to grab power of the throne? Yoav, verse 7, our trusted friend. He conferred with Yoav, the son of Tzeruiah, and together with Eviatar the priest, the former Kohen Gadol. And they supported Adoniah. So some of David's old friends who maybe had a falling out with David, the relationships were tenuous, to say the least, during the course of the book of Shmuel, they take the opportunity to jump on it and go with Adoniah. And remember, what's one of the things about Yoav? Yoav doesn't like weakness. He's been very critical of David in some of David's weaknesses. Remember, he was very against when David said, don't do anything to Avshalom. He didn't like that. Yoav is not a fan of weakness. And in this text, David is a little on the weaker side. He's frail, he's old, he does not appoint a new successor. So Yoav says, we're going with the next guy. Let's go. It will be a devastating decision for him. Verse 8. V'tzadok HaKohen uVe'anayahu ben Yehoyada v'Natan HaNavi v'Shim'i v'Re'i v'Hagiborim asher leDavid lo hayu im Adoniyahu. There are people who are left off the guest list to Adoniyahu's coronation, which we'll read about in the next Pesukim. Tzadok HaKohen, the current Kohen Gadol, Benayahu ben Yehoyada, who we know to be one of David's trusted warriors, and he was in charge of David's personal security detail. Natan HaNavi, Natan the prophet, who was the one who reported to David after Bathsheba's sin, right? Okay. Reported to David, Natan HaNavi, Shim'i v'Re'i, and the other warriors of David, lo hayu im Adoniah. They were not with Adoniah. So they got left off the guest list because they're loyal to David. Adoniah's not inviting them to the party. That's a great question. Natan HaNavi is a very interesting character here because one thing that Adoniah does not have in his camp that David has in his camp is a what? Is a prophet. So notice how they both have a general. One has Yoav, one has Benayahu ben Yehoyada. They both have a Kohen. One has Eviatar, one has Sadok. But that makes the absence for Adoniah of a prophet all the more glaring that David has a prophet with him, right? And Natan is giving the word of God to David, right? And he perhaps had something over who should be the successor. We'll see Natan plays a very interesting role in this chapter of getting Shlomo to the throne. But interestingly enough, he will not give a prophecy. We will not see God anywhere in this chapter come out of the woodwork, as it were, and say, this is who should be the king. We don't see it in this chapter. So it's not a prophet. The prophet, that would be his role, but fascinatingly enough, he won't play that role. Now, Natan will not come to David and say, God came to me and said, he should be king. That will not happen. We will see how it does happen. Correct. Natan cannot solicit a prophecy from God. Either God gives it or God doesn't. But it's interesting that God could solve the tension very easily by just saying something. That doesn't happen. Instead, the characters have to go about their business normally, but Natan will offer some very, very important advice to the king, and it will all be based on a promise that was made earlier on that we have no knowledge of to this point, but it will be told to us in this chapter. What are you saying? Yeah. Right. But notice how we never had, like when Shaul was king, we didn't have a tug of war who should be the king. Shemuel anointed the king because God told him to. And with David, Shemuel told David, God told Shemuel, it's going to be David. So we didn't have that tug of war the way we're going to have it now. So the successor of David has a lot more turmoil attached to it.
Without it being something against his father, and then again, everything that he did
Right.
supposedly was so ambiguous that David took it as, okay, it could be taken this way, that way. He gave
Right.
his son a benefit.
So that's interesting. Right.
That he always did it in a way,
Right.
and then he put out in that time's mind, well, did the thoughts change? I didn't so much, I didn't come back to me.
Okay.
Didn't tell me anything. And good looking is one of the things that you're supposed to be when you're a leader.
Right. You need to be charismatic. You need to have people to pick on. Yeah. So definitely Adoniah fits the profile. And I like what you said in the beginning, which is that Adoniah's rebellion, if we call it that, is very different than Avshalom's. Avshalom sought to rip the kingdom away from his father David, seeing that he wasn't fit to rule anymore. Here, it's obvious David is at the end. He's frail, he's sick. Everybody's aware that the kingdom is going to be passed. Right, and he didn't appoint anybody. So Adoniah is not necessarily ripping the kingdom away from David. He's just seizing an opportunity for a vacuum to come and take it. Exactly, and that's going to make a major difference. Whereas by the case of Avshalom, what has to happen to resolve the conflict between David and Avshalom? We have to have a war. We have to have a full-out war, and someone needs to die before that happens. That's not going to happen to Adoniah, because by the end of the chapter, when David comes out and says, Shlomo is my guy, Adoniah and everybody, they just run away. They just flee, because they're petrified, they're scared. They're hoping that David will not make a decision. That's what Adoniah is really banking on. He's banking on the fact that David will die without making a decision, and he will be able to ascend the throne. So he's taking a major risk together with his people that they will grab onto power because David will be lax in appointing a person. Once David makes that appointment, they're done, right? The rebellion just crumbles on its own. So let's see how that happens. Yeah.
That he's older
Then Shlomo, yes, right. Which is why it makes sense. He thinks he's the next in line. Let's go to verse 9. So what does he do? He stages a coronation. Adoniah made a sacrificial feast of sheep, oxen, and fatlings at the Zochelet stone, which is near En Rogel. Important to note, if you look at a map, En Rogel is just outside of Yerushalayim, but outside of Yerushalayim. Important to note that, because when we get to Shlomo's coronation, his will take place inside Yerushalayim, and Yerushalayim is David's home base. That's his territory. So he does it. Adoniah does it like a little on the outside. He's trying to hide it. He doesn't want to call attention to it so much in the eyes of David. So he does it a little bit outside. But Vayikra et kol echav bnei hamelech. He invites all of his brothers, the other princes of the royal family, ulchol anshe Yehuda avdei hamelech, and to all of the other members of Yehuda, the servants of the king. Verse 10. Ve'et Natan hanavi v'Avnayahu v'et hageburim v'et Shlomo achiv lo kara. But he did not invite the prophet Natan or Benaiah or the fighting men, and especially not his brother Shlomo, because Adoniah knows if there's one other person who could be his threat, it's Shlomo. So he clearly keeps Shlomo on the outs. Offering a sacrifice that has not been asked for, like outside the Mishkan, so to speak. So I don't think that in this context, the word vayizbach means that he made it an official sacrifice. I know that usually the word a zevach or zevachim connotes a sacrifice. Vayizbach can also just mean he slaughtered, right? He made a feast. Does it use the word sacrifice in the translation over there? It says sacrificial feast, right? Right. So it's possible that he does, because there's no temple, because there's no Bet HaMikdash, and the Mishkan is still in flux. It's very possible that at this time, it is permissible to make your own altar and offer your own sacrifices in a more temporary way, because there isn't a central place of worship that is agreed upon right at this point at all time. Again, kind of highlights the idea of not being a temple, which is going to lead us into Shlomo, who builds the temple, right? So we're definitely in a period of flux when it comes to formal service in a temple. So yes. Why is he the only one? Possibly he's the next oldest, which is one possibility. Also, it's clear that Shlomo has a level of love by David, right? That we saw already in the book of Shmuel, right? A little bit, right? And God loves him. So it seems as though intuitively Adoniah senses that if there's anybody else who could be a problem to him, it would be Shlomo. Correct. And there is, we haven't yet uncovered it, but the text will tell us that there is a promise that was given by David to Bathsheba. Whether Adoniah knows about that promise or heard about it, not 100% sure. Maybe he has, and so that's why he's also weary of Shlomo. We don't know anything about a promise yet, but that's about to come up. We don't see that overtly in the text. It's very possible that behind the scenes, because of Shlomo's promise and because of the type of person he was and how wise he will be at a very young age, it's possible that he did have service with Natan HaNavi. But in the text, Pshat text, we didn't find that. Verse 11. So now comes Natan HaNavi and Bathsheba, the two of them, one the prophet, one the mother of who should be the king, are going to come and with this very elaborate plan. They're going to stage this very interesting story. And we've seen different plays and stages being done to David in the past, for those who remember back into the book of Shemuel, when Yoav had that woman dress up and make a play, and then another one made a play, and Natan himself did a whole mashal. Sometimes when you orchestrate like this story and these theatrics, it resonates with the king a lot more. We're going to see theatrics come into this now between Natan and Bathsheba. They have one goal in mind. How do we get David to appoint Shlomo formally? We need David to get out of this, whatever he's going through, this frail moment where he's leaving the power up in the air, and we need David to make a decision, because we know once David makes his decision, then everything will fall into place. But they got to get him to do that, and that doesn't seem like such an easy task. Verse 11. Vayomer Natan el Bathsheba em Shlomo lemor. Natan says to Bathsheba, the mother of Shlomo. Notice that's how she's referred to, because that's her claim to fame at this point. That's what she's important to the story. He says to her, Halo shamat, behold, have you heard? Ki malach Adoniyahu ben Chagit, that Adoniah has assumed the throne. He coronated himself. Va'adonenu David lo yada, and our master David has no knowledge of this. Verse 12. Ve'ata, and now, lechi i'atzech na etza. Take my advice. I'm going to give you what we should do over here. Umaleti et nafshech, and by doing this, you will save your life. Ve'et nefesh benech Shlomo, and the life of your son Solomon. Why does Natan believe that Bathsheba and Shlomo are in danger? Exactly, because what is the first thing that any king does when they get the throne? They demolish their competition. So he says, if Adoniah is successful at doing what he's trying to do, and David dies and you don't get appointed, you and Shlomo are on the chopping block. So this is really your life is at stake right now. Verse 13. Lechi uboi el hamelech David. Go now and come to the king David. Ve'amart elav, and you should say the following to him. Halo ata Adoni hamelech nishbata la'amatecha lemor. Behold, you, master the king, you swore to your maidservant and said, Ki Shlomo benech yimloch acharai, that Shlomo, my son, will be the king after you. Vehu yeshev al kis'i, and he will sit on my throne. Umadua malach Adoniyahu. And so why has Adoniyahu assumed the throne? He tells her to say it to her in this way, like, didn't you promise me that this was what was going to happen? In like a rhetorical question to kind of really shock David a little bit, right? And you don't know what's going on. 14, and Natan says, while you're still in the presence of the king and you're still speaking to him, I'm going to barge in. I'm going to barge into the audience of the king, and I will fill in the missing pieces of what you are to say, right? What I need to tell the king. In other words, Natan is then going to add in more details to corroborate the story of Bathsheba, right? So why do you think just at first hand they need to play this kind of like back and forth, this theatrics. What is that going to do for David? Okay, maybe he doesn't remember the promise, so he needs to be kind of jolted back into it. But is Bathsheba not enough to do that? He needs Natan to also come in. Is Natan not enough to do that? So maybe Natan wants to present it as if he got it from God. That's a dangerous business, though. You as a prophet, you can't really tell something that you didn't hear from God as if you heard it from God. So I don't think Natan's going to try to present this as if he got a prophecy from Hashem when he really did it. I think already the promise is enough at this point. What do you think?
I think that it's because of his complicated relationship with Bathsheba that he can't be, he's appointing someone as king because Bathsheba asked for it.
Okay, good. Right, so I agree with Julie, right? The idea is David's relationship with Bathsheba is a complicated one, right? That's the word that you use, right? It's definitely a complicated one. And Bathsheba, her presence always reminds him of his greatest sin, his worst moment in his time as king, right? And so maybe if it was just Bathsheba, people would say David's doing it to cover up, or he's trying to appease. The fact that Natan HaNavi, what role did Natan HaNavi play in the story of Bathsheba? He was David's biggest critic. That he should come in and support Bathsheba in the story and team together to get Shlomo shows you that this is valid and that it presents to everybody, but also reminds David, now is not the time to be wallowing in your sin. Now is the time for action. Now is the time to get up and do what you promised to do, which is to appoint Shlomo. And it's fascinating that Shlomo is going to be the king. Because really, if you think about it, Shlomo is what? It's the most illegitimate of all the people. He's the one who was produced by the marriage of David and Bathsheba, right? You can make the argument that the last person David would want to be the next king after him is the one who always reminds him of the sin and reminds everybody of the sin. But that's exactly the point. That is the person who we want, because Shlomo is able to rise above the cloud of the sin of David to say on his own merit and on the merit of David's teshuvah that he should be the one to go ahead and be the king. So it's specifically Shlomo who's going to be the one to take over to remind everybody that you could rise above the sin. And if you act and if you don't wallow, you can fix it and you can move forward in it. It clearly, yes, the text tells us that he did marry her. Yes. Correct, but still, the taking of her in the first place was shady, was difficult, right? Yes. There's no question that I think the sin, that David's reservations about acting and being proactive are because his sins are weighing him down. There's no question about it. And that's what they're trying to tell him. Now's not the time to let your sins weigh you down. You can't let that happen. You need to act and push into the forefront to get Shlomo, because that's who needs to become the king. It has to be that way. Yeah, perhaps. It could be a metaphor for that as well. The clothing being a representation of David and the sins that are kind of weighing him down and not warming him up. Yeah, go ahead.
It's a hard thing to hold in terms of free will right now and was meant to be. Because David's wallowing about his sin, it's not about my sin, but we needed him to do this sin.
So he's going to step up to the plate. We're being hard on David, but he's going to step up to the plate. He's being hard on himself, correct. There's nobody who's more of a critic to himself than David. And that's a good lesson to learn from David as well. They're telling him, David, you're being too hard on yourself, right? This shouldn't be the way it is. But David is overcome with it. And you understand why, right? We're always often our most difficult critics. We're the ones who have a hard time moving on from mistakes that we've made. It's very challenging, right? Very, very challenging. But that's what Natan and Bathsheba, the people who love him and know his true character, are telling him. But you can't let this stay in, right, and be a roadblock to the growth of the Jewish people and of your family, because there's more to you than your sin. You're more than that. Yeah. The Abishag story. Mm-hmm. Good. Yeah. Great. Great. So that's a great way of bringing the Avishag story back into it, because it continues to bring full circle this idea of the sin and how David rose above it. And I'm going to bring back Avishag into the story in a minute, because the text is going to bring her back in what will be for a woman one of the most awkward scenarios that will ever happen for you. But it will call attention to this very fact that Candice is mentioning. So I'm going to revisit back in just a moment. So all of this is happening behind. By the way, we're taking we've been reading the story. I thought we were going to read it more the political way. We're actually reading it more the spiritual way first. I'm going to double back and tell you a little bit more the political way, but we've kind of hit it a little bit. Let's go to verse 16. So Bathsheba is ready to enact the plan, and time is of the essence. They cannot wait. Every second counts. Verse 15, excuse me, right? Verse 15. So Bathsheba comes to the king's private chamber. And the king is very old and frail. And Avishag HaShunamit is in the process of serving the king. Now just think about how awkward this is, okay? Bathsheba is David's wife, by the way, the wife whom he took in a very, unsavory way, to say the least, right? And she now walks in to tell David about what David has promised to her as her wife, and there's another woman lying in bed with him. That's the scene. It's a very awkward scene, all right? I mean, we're laughing because it makes us so uncomfortable, but perhaps, but it's still that. But the point is just that. The point is just that. Bathsheba is walking in, and it doesn't faze her. It doesn't faze her that Avishag is there. Why? Because she knows that David is not using Avishag in that way. He knows that that's not what's happening over here, right? Right. Perhaps, but I think it's more than that. I think that it's telling us what Candice said before, that she knows David has elevated above his sin. This is not an intimate thing whatsoever, and it doesn't faze her, but it definitely is happening in the background. All of that is definitely creating a cloud over here, but that's a cloud that she wants to break open, right? Because apparently an unmarried girl produces more bodily heat. Yeah. Yeah, don't it? This is what it tells us, and we have to respect it. It is what it is. Yeah. Verse 16. Yeah, verse 16. Batikod Bathsheba vatishtachu lamelech. Bathsheba prostrates herself and bows before the king. Vayomer hamelech malach. And the king says, what troubles you? Why are you here? Verse 17. Vatomer lo. She says to him, Adoni, my master. Atan nishbata badonai Elohecha la'amatecha. You swore in the name of the Lord your God to your maidservant. Notice she inserts that idea of Hashem Elokecha. This was an oath in the name of God. Perhaps that's where Natan HaNavi also played a role. Shlomo benech yimloch aharai. That Shlomo, my son, will rule after you. V'hu yeshev al kis'i. And he will sit upon your throne, on my throne. These are the words of David. Verse 18. Ve'ata hinei Adoniya malach. And now behold, Adoniya has become king. Ve'ata Adoni hamelech lo yadata. And now you, my master, the king, did not know about it. Va'izbach shor umri v'tzon larov. And he has slaughtered and offered a major sacrificial feast of oxen and fatlings and sheep. And he called to all of the king's children and Eviatar Kohen and Yoav the general. But to Shlomo your son, your servant, he has not called. Notice, by the way, that she's adding a little bit more here than what Natan had originally given to her. She's definitely going further and further, trying to tug on the emotional heart of the king. She says, now, my master, the king, the eyes of the Jewish people upon you. Everybody looks to you for the decision. Tell them, who will sit upon the throne of my master, the king, after him. Verse 21, and otherwise, when my lord the king lies down with his fathers, that is to say, he passed away, if you don't make an appointment here, then me and my son Shlomo will be the sinners. Notice how she uses that word. The sinners. How will everybody look at us? We're the ones who David sinned with. That's why we were rejected, because I'm Bathsheba and he's Shlomo. We're not just going to be rejected, we're going to be sinners in the eyes of the people. We need you, David, in the name of God, to clear our name. Well, how is she flipping the story? Are you going to make us the sinners, so to speak?
He might be afraid because it'll draw attention to us. And she said,
that'll only keep the sin even worse. Correct. Absolutely. Yeah. Very, very strong words and a very, very powerful speech on the part of Bathsheba towards David. Yeah. Right. Definitely begging for her life and trying to pull on those strings, bunch of different strings, right? She pulls on the legacy of David. She pulls on the life of Shlomo and Bathsheba, whom David certainly loves. She pulls on, what the turmoil that will be there. She's pulling on the guilt. Right. So she's definitely strategically trying to, I don't want to say manipulate. It's a very ugly word. I think manipulate looks like an ugly word. Like she's speaking to his heart and trying to come from different angles as to why David, because maybe the guilt won't pull him, but the love for Bathsheba and Shlomo will. He's trying to use all his resources to get David to be able to act over it. The word offended. I like the word hataim literally means sinners. In this case, it could mean, the context could mean, so offenders is, in the context, the word offenders makes sense. In other words, we'll be looked at as being offensive to the king, or traitors, I have the word in Sophia, to the king. But the reason why she uses the word chataim, even though the context means a traitor, that word chataim is a trigger word for David. There's no question it's a trigger word for David. And she wants to use that word specifically. This is where sometimes Hebrew and translation, that's a lost in translation. She uses the word chataim to trigger that idea of sin inside of David. I think there's no question about that. Yeah. Correct. Everything. Yeah. I agree with you 100%, for sure. They're trying to change the narrative, absolutely. Verse 22, now Natan HaNavi takes his role. She's currently speaking with the king, Natan HaNavi ba. Natan HaNavi enters. They say to the king, Natan HaNavi. Oh, Natan HaNavi is coming. He comes before the king. And he too prostrates himself upon the land in front of David. Natan says, Adoni HaMelech, my master, the king. Ata amarta, you said, Adoniya yimloch acharai. Adoniya will rule after you. Vehu yeshev al kisi, and he will sit upon my throne. So, by the way, also the fact that he's coming in as well corroborates the idea that Bathsheba is not making this up, right? She's not just, being dramatic. She's not going overly, over the top. If Natan comes and corroborates the story independently, it also calls into this, we got to act fast. We have to be alert here. And every minute counts because he keeps telling us how old David is, and he's in his last breaths, right? Verse 25. Ki yarad hayom vayizbach shor umri v'tzon larov vayikra lechol bnei hamelech usarei hasava u'Eviatar hakohen v'hinam ochlim v'shotim. He says they went down today and they offered the sacrifices and they ate and they had a big feast and they called all the people to come, the bnei hamelech and the generals and Eviatar, and they're eating and drinking. Vayomru, and they said, Yehi hamelech Adoniyahu. Long live the king Adoniyahu. Notice he adds that detail in that we haven't seen until now. Those words will be a trigger for any king. Long live the next king and not your name. Ooh, that definitely sends goosebumps around your body if you're David, right? Verse 26. Veli ani avdecha ultzadok hakohen ulbenayahu ben Yehoyada. And for me, your servant, and Tzadok HaKohen and Benayahu ben Yehoyada, your trusted inner circle. V'lishlomo avdecha lo kara. To Shlomo, your servant, he did not call. Verse 27. Im me'et Adoni HaMelech niyah hadavar hazeh. Can this decision have come from my lord the king? So look, Natan says, maybe the king authorized this, right? He leaves like a little room for like maybe be respectful. Could it be that the king authorized this? Maybe he changed his mind, maybe not. But he knows he didn't. Like he's almost doing it rhetorically, but he's leaving that open to be respectful, right? Defensive, right? Is it possible that the king's, this decision came from the king, right? Velo hodata et avdecha, and you didn't let me know. I think you let the Navi know. Mi yeshev al kiseh Adoni HaMelech acharav, who will sit upon the king's throne after him? So finally, after all these theatrics, David hasn't been able to get in a word edgewise because his wife and the prophet have taken the show. Finally, David speaks up. Vayan HaMelech David vayomen. The king David says, Kir'u li leBathsheba. Call Bathsheba into me. Which, by the way, suggests, although we didn't see it before, that Bathsheba exited. she left the room, because if he's telling her to come back, she exited the room. So it now, by the way, splits them up like they weren't in cahoots with each other. She comes before the king and she stands before the king. A lot of lifnei hamelech, before the king, reiterating that idea, David is the king, but he's ready to transfer that power. So they're trying to be respectful while at the same time getting him to act like the king. Because one of the things you act like the king is by passing your kingship to the next generation. Verse 29, the king swore and he said, Chai Adonai, as the Lord lives, asher pada et nafshi mikol tzara, who has rescued me from every trouble. He starts out with this very flamboyant way, right? God has saved me, like he's rejuvenated, right? He's excited. For just as I had swore to you, taking the oath in the name of God, the King of the Lord of Israel, saying, Ki Shlomo benech yimloch acharai, that Shlomo, your son, will rule after me, and he will sit on my throne after me. This is what I shall do on this day. David says, I'm immediately acting. Bathsheba prostrates herself upon the land in humility. She bows before the king. She says, long live the King David forever. Right? A nice way of ending that back and forth. Now David's got to spring into action. Verse 32. David the king says, call now Sadok HaKohen and Natan, and to Benayahu the son of Yehoiada, and they come before the king. The king is now going to stage a formal coronation of Shlomo in the eyes of everybody, which will effectively end any hope that Adoniah and his posse have to do it. No, he doesn't need to. He knows that if he puts his stamp on the coronation of Shlomo, that will end it. He doesn't have to do more than that. Yeah. The king says to them, take my loyal servants and soldiers down with you, and I want you to ride Shlomo down on my mule, right? That and bring him down to the Gichon. So they're going to take Shlomo down to the Gichon River. That's a river that actually runs through the city of Yerushalayim. They're going to take him down on a mule. I'm not exactly sure the significance of that imagery. Perhaps it's Mashiach-esque. They say Mashiach comes on a donkey. Maybe it has like a little bit of that, the humility of it. I'm not sure. But Shlomo is going to be coronated now publicly by the Gichon stream. Just a nice little tidbit of halakha here. The rabbis learn over here that all kings have to be coronated by a body of water, by a flowing body of water. And the symbolism of that is that just like the river flows, the kingdom should also flow, should be nimshach. And from there, we have our custom on Rosh Hashanah to do tashlich. Where does the custom go to a body of water and say prayers that coronate the king on Rosh Hashanah? It comes from this concept that we also say we're praying that the kingdom of God should be flowing and should be clear and should be public to everybody. And we do it by a body of water on Rosh Hashanah on the day that we all coronate God as king. And it's learned from this pasuk. Definitely a public place. People are coming for water. Water is a very well-attended area, so it means a lot. So there's symbolism and there's also pragmatism to it as well. Verse 34, we'll read a couple more psukim. We won't have the time to finish it because it goes into the 50s today, so we'll have to pick up the second half of the chapter, but I just want to finish David's command. Umashach oto sham tzadok hakohen v'natan hanavi lemelech al Yisrael. Let the priest Tzadok and the prophet Natan anoint him there as king over Israel. Utkatem b'shofar, and you're going to blow the shofar to signal to everyone. Va'amartem, and you shall say, Yehi hamelech Shlomo, long live the king Shlomo. Verse 35, Va'alitem acharav uba v'yashav al kis'i. Then march up after him and let him come in and sit upon my throne. V'hu yimloch tachtai, and he will rule in my succession. Ve'oto tziviti lihiyot nagid al Yisrael ve'al Yehuda. For he shall succeed me as king. Him I designated to be ruler of Israel and of Yehuda. So this is David's command. We will see in the next Pesukim that they will follow through with this command. And then the rest of the chapter is going to say what reaction Adoniah and Yoav have to this eventually happening, because they know their time is running out. When they hear that David has done what they had hoped he wouldn't, which is formally appoint a successor, they know that they're about to meet their end and their fates are sealed. But how that happens is very, very interesting. Shlomo is going to be very, very different. I think you're going to like how Shlomo handles the situation than the way David may have handled the situation during his time. Not that David was wrong, but it called for something different. Shlomo in his name is Shalom, peace, right? So we will see that Shlomo will deal with the threats to his throne, like Adoniah, like Yoav, with a little more of a gentle hand than what we've seen. A little more finesse is a good word than what we've seen in the past. The result will be the same, but not because of that Shlomo, but because of mistakes that the people themselves will make. They're going to make some really bad errors. And then you're going to say, okay, Shlomo was right for kind of what he did. So there's definitely a little bit more to kind of explore. One last point, I'll just end on the Avishag point, just to bring it back to the very beginning, was there is a political way to kind of read the beginning of the story, which is that who were the servants that told Avishag told David to search for Avishag? It may have been the same servants that supported Adoniah. Why would the servants who supported Adoniah, why would he do that? Could be of a distraction. Could be a reminder of Bathsheba. Definitely. I think also on a very practical level, what do they, very good. They have to look around and they have to go searching for somebody. No, but also they have to tell everybody. They have to tell everybody, right? In other words, the king is on his way out. The king is frail, right? Think of the Queen of England. Nobody wants to tell us what's really going on, right? Nobody wants to say what's really happening. Details are very hard to come by. When the royal is on their way out, everybody kind of conceals the information. What do the servants of Adoniah very cunningly do? They say, oh, you know what you should do? Go search all throughout the lands for a woman who's going to come and warm up the king. When they do that, word spreads around that the king is old. So when Adoniah says, oh, I'm going to be king, while they're all preoccupied with something else, people say, yeah, we really need a king. The king's really old. If they need to search for a woman to kind of keep his body temperature going, hey, he can go at any minute. We need him. Yeah, get it. The panic will set in, and that will also create a nice environment for Adoniah to try to grab onto it. Unfortunately, because they just catch it in the nick of time, Bathsheba and Natan's fast acting plan saves the situation. Shlomo will eventually become the king. We'll read the rest of the chapter, Be'ezat Hashem, in our next class and move into chapter 2 as well. Questions or comments before we, So good question. Why Yisrael and Yehuda? We've always seen that Yehuda gets like its own separate comment, always. Perhaps like a little foreshadow of the fact that the kingdoms will tear apart into Israel and Yehuda, but also because Yehuda always had a little bit of an elitist feel to it. The kings come from Yehuda. Yehuda is always the largest tribe of everybody, the most numerous tribe. They lead them into battle. So they always have a little bit of a leg up, and therefore they're always mentioned somewhat distinct from the rest of Israel, which will only become more and more pronounced as we go through this book and we see the kingdom split in two, Israel and Yehuda. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.